Wait. First you booed me, now you're applauding? Thank you very much for allowing me to be a part of this debate tonight as your moderator. The candidates have already been briefed on how this debate is going to unfold, but I want to reiterate that so you understand what it is we're working towards tonight, and the candidates can have a little bit of a refresher as we go over this. In order for this event to be safe and inclusive to all, we are going to be setting some community ground rules here at the School of Architecture. First and foremost, there will be absolutely zero tolerance for hate speech, personal attacks towards candidates or other participants, or anything of the like. In order to have productive conversations and a healthy democracy, respect for one another in this room is absolutely essential. Secondly, while disagreement is inevitable and healthy discourse is encouraged, our debate is tightly structured for verbal discussions between candidates and you, the community. Various forms of protest, however, will not be permitted in order that we ensure everyone has a chance to hear candidates' positions on various subjects, especially as we have many topics to cover in a relatively short amount of time. So here's what you can expect from the format of our debate tonight. Each candidate is going to be given 1 minute for an introductory statement, why they're running, why they're participating in this debate, and whatever else they choose to use to fill that 60 seconds. Then there are 4 standard questions that are being asked at all of these 100 debates on the environment across the country. Each candidate has seen these questions in advance and will have 90 seconds to issue their reply. After that, we'll take a bit of a break, we'll get a snack, we'll use the washroom. It'll give you an opportunity to have your question deposited into our green bucket that's at the doors as you came in. So if you want to get your question into there, we'll have an opportunity to have those answered after our break. When the break is finished, we will have 3 more questions that the candidates have seen in advance, and these are environmental questions as they pertain to us here in the region of Waterloo and the city of Cambridge. Each candidate will again have 90 seconds to issue a reply. That's when we get to 3 questions from those posed by you here in our audience this evening. And again, each candidate will get 90 seconds to reply to the questions that you would like posed. Now, also on the table in front of our candidates are a couple of cards. They're called rebuttal cards. These cards can be used at the discretion of the candidate to offer a 90-second rebuttal after another candidate has replied to a standard or local question. A rebuttal allows the candidate to respond to points made by other candidates or to restate their own position. So the candidate would signal their desire to make a rebuttal by holding up one of their R cards. They have just 2 in front of them. Once they hold one up, it will be surrendered and they will only have 1 remaining. More than one candidate can make a rebuttal after a single question response. If a candidate's response calls out another candidate or makes reference to that candidate by name, the called out candidate will have the option to make a mini response after the initial candidate's response is complete. The called out candidate would signal this desire to make a mini response by holding up the MR card. That candidate then gets up to 30 seconds for the mini response. Once we're through all of the questions, the rebuttals, the mini responses, each candidate will then have 2 minutes for concluding remarks. So I just want to stress again the need for decorum and civility in the room tonight. I am as passionate as you are about this election, the issues being discussed, and particularly the issue of the environment that we will be discussing tonight. But we have stressed to the candidates ahead of time, and I remind you here now that we will demand respect for one another's viewpoints, conversations, and replies. We won't be talking over one another. There will be ample opportunity, I do believe, to have viewpoints heard here tonight. If we choose to carry on in a disrespectful manner, you will be asked to leave the auditorium tonight. So I just want to make sure that's clear. I'm a pretty easygoing guy, but if we have to, we'll get tough. We want to make sure we have a good discussion in this room tonight. So, Here's to a good debate. The order of the candidates was determined randomly tonight, and we're going to be starting with Brian May, who is our Liberal candidate, then David Haskell with the People's Party of Canada, then on to Michelle Brenef with the Green Party, and Scott Hamilton with the NDP for the questions, and we'll just move on down the line. So once Brian, he'll get the opportunity to answer the first question. David will get the opportunity to answer first with our second question, and so on down the table. Once again, I've gone over the rules of decorum. I think I've stretched those enough. So let's move into our debate and the 4 standard questions that are being asked across each of the 100 debates on the environment being held across Canada. Actually, I can't ask them until I give you your chance for your opening statements, so I apologize. You want to boo me this time? I deserve it now. So let's get to the opening statements. Oh, and I just want to make that clear too. Sorry, I know the candidates have been briefed on this, so we have a timekeeper right in the front row, and there is a red card, a yellow card that will flash when you're down to 15 seconds, and a red card when your time is up. Again, I'm a reasonable human, but once you see that red card, please finish your thought, finish your answer, and let's not take it on too long because we do have a lot of material to cover. All right, I've covered all of those ground rules. Mr. May, if you please, 60 seconds for your opening statement.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here and speak with everyone this evening. My name is Brian May, and it's been an honor to be your Member of Parliament for Cambridge, North Dumfries, and North Brant for the past 4 years. Even before I was involved in politics, I've spent my life fighting for people who needed help. During those experiences, I've seen the impacts that politics can make and how policy, when done well, makes an impact on the lives of all Canadians. I'm running to build upon the progress that we have made. Our government has done more for the environment than any in Canadian history. We put a price on pollution, all while creating more than 1 million new jobs. We protected our environment while having the lowest unemployment in 40 years. Our economic strength has allowed us to lift more than 850,000 people out of poverty, including 300,000 children. But we have even more progress to do. And that's what I am fighting for, and that's why I'm asking for your support. Thank you.
David Haskell, People's Party.
Thank you. My name is David Haskell. I am your People's Party candidate for Cambridge. Thank you for coming out tonight. I am a 20-year resident of Cambridge. I live here with my 5 kids and my wife. I've been a high school teacher, a musician, college professor, a reporter, and now I am a professor at Wilfrid Laurier University, and I've been there for about 15 years. What I'm hoping to do tonight is to explore diversity of ideas. My party is the party of political incorrectness. That is to say, we don't think that any topic is taboo. And so tonight, I'm going to be bringing some ideas that you might not be familiar with. And I'm eager to hear from the other side as well. We, in the People's Party, we have the strongest freedom of expression statement. And I'm so pleased to be in Canada where we can exercise our right to free expression, and we'll see that happen this evening. Thank you.
Thank you, David. Michelle Brenef of the Green Party.
I'm an entrepreneur, social innovator, community advocate, an artist, and a grandmother. I spent a number of years as a lawyer, as a mediator. I was middle management for Lutherwood. I ran Lutherwood Family Counseling Services. I've been on boards of directors for Waterloo Wellington Training and Adjustment Board, the Social Planning Council, and Five Oaks Center in Brant County. And I have a passion for social innovation. I graduated with a diploma from the University of Waterloo, and in my business as a graphic recorder, I have worked with leaders in the nonprofit sector, municipal government, university, and I've facilitated policy discussions on some of the most wicked and complex social problems facing us in Brant and Cambridge and Waterloo region. And that's why I'm running for the Green Party, because it is time to bring social innovation to politics. It's time for a transition to a sustainable, caring society. There is no planet B.
Thank you, Michelle. And Scott Hamilton with the NDP.
Hi. Thanks everyone for coming out tonight. My name is Scott Hamilton. I'm your friendly neighborhood NDP candidate. How did I get here? I used to actually be a landscaper. I worked minimum wage in retail. I worked in human resources at a corporate head office. Wasn't really my thing, so I went back to school as a mature student, studied very hard. I ended up earning a master's degree at the University of Oxford in international politics, got a scholarship to do my PhD at the LSE in international politics, and for the past 2 years I've been a Banting postdoctoral fellow at the Balsillie School in Wilfrid Laurier, teaching environmental security, international security, and some political theory as well. I decided to run for the NDP because 1 year ago my son was born at CMH and my perspective changed. I started thinking a lot more about the future, what it's going to be like for him, and of course studying climate change and climatic catastrophe. The future scared me. So I'm running to create a better future for him, for all of our families, and for Cambridge, and that's why I'm asking for your vote on October 21st.
Thank you very much. And a terrific start in keeping to our allotted time. That's very well done by everyone. Okay. Let's move on then to the questions. And again, Brian May will get the opportunity to answer first with our first question, and we'll move on down the line from there. These questions, as I mentioned before, are being asked of all candidates participating in each of the 100 debates on the environment being held across Canada. We will be developing additional local questions, and we'll share with you well in advance of their being asked later in the debate. So let's begin with climate change. Around the world, we are seeing inspiring examples of leadership to reduce greenhouse gas pollution and accelerate the shift to a green economy. At the same time, we are seeing a ramp up of the effects of climate change, and the scientific consensus is that we have little more than a decade to turn things around. We see extreme weather events across the country, including wildfires, flooding, and droughts. These are causing anxiety and worry given their enormous financial and environmental impact. Per person, Canadians produce the most GHG pollution of all G20 industrialized nations, nearly 3 times the G20 average and 8 tons per person. What are the key elements of an action plan that you will advocate for to ensure Canada meets its international obligations to reduce greenhouse gas pollution? Brian.
Thank you. And I wish we had more time because, quite frankly, a minute and a half is not nearly enough time to go through all 50 different initiatives that our government has already started with the force of over $70 billion. But I'll touch on a few highlights. We've invested in over 1,200 public transit systems. We put a price on pollution, and we've taken that money and put it back in the hands of people and communities. We're phasing out coal by 2030 while investing in renewable power like wind and solar and making sure that transition away from coal is fair for workers and communities that rely upon that industry. We've doubled the amount of nature that's protected and started the process of banning harmful plastics. But we need to do more. And that is why in our platform we've made a commitment to net zero emissions for Canada by 2050. How are we going to do this? There's a lot of different ways, but one of the things that we're going to do is we're going to cut corporate tax rates in half for the production and manufacturing of zero-emission technologies. We're retrofitting over 1.1 million homes, investing $3 billion to plant 2 billion trees by 2030 and increase the carbon store in nature. And we're going to invest in clean power and making electric vehicles more affordable. Thank you.
Thank you, Brian. David.
Thank you. Given the limited time, I want to focus on a portion of the question that I think needs some clarification. The claim was made in the question that we're seeing a ramp up of the effects of climate change and that the scientific consensus says we have a decade to turn things around. In my mind, that claim is misleading and doesn't present the full picture revealed by the current research. For example, Oxford University keeps a climate-related deaths database, and these are deaths from floods, extreme or hot, cold weather, droughts, and storms. That research shows that the climate-related deaths have declined 97% since 1900. And not only have deaths due to climate gone down in the extreme, current research shows that climate impact on the world economy is not going to be significant. Here's a direct quote from the latest report of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, 2013, Working Group 2, Chapter 10, page 662. For most economic sectors, The impact of climate change will be small relative to the impact of other drivers. In contrast, drivers like population, age, regulation, technology, and others will have an impact on economic goods and services that is large relative to the impact of climate change. I'm happy to discuss even more research that shows the climate alarmism is actually misplaced. Thank you.
Thank you, David. Michelle.
The Green Party has been advocating for action to protect the environment for a long, long time. We're not really on track, and we need to up our game. So the Green Party has come up with Mission Possible. It's an action plan. It's got specific, measurable goals that are actionable, and there's accountability. So it's to cut back on emissions with legal limits for industries that decline over time with penalties. Instead of the weak and ineffective liberal carbon tax, the Green Party is advocating a revenue-neutral carbon fee at source with a dividend that goes directly to the people. No new pipelines, end the subsidies, ban fracking. This plan is calling to use all the tools in the government toolbox: regulation, public spending, pollution pricing, all hands on deck, municipality, province, and calling on Indigenous leadership because they're people who have a tradition of stewardship of the land. And there would be a Climate Change Act, a ramp up to a green economy. The Green Party is calling for a national transportation strategy, a national electricity grid, building retrofits, and a transition plan in collaboration with local communities for workers who are displaced. And there's a window of opportunity, and this is the last election that we have the leisure of planning, because 2023 will be too late to start planning.
Thank you, Michelle. And to Scott.
Thank you. The science is incredibly rigorous. CO2 parts per million were 280 at about the Industrial Revolution when it started. When I checked yesterday, they're up to about 412. So despite, and this is where I think a lot of the frustration comes from us as residents, despite a lot of political talk and acknowledgement now that this crisis is grave and it's serious, we see very little action. There's lots of talk, but little walking the walk. So one of the reasons I'm excited to run for the NDP is that their plan, it's called the Power to Change. It's really the Green New Deal, if anyone's familiar with that. It demands rapid action immediately. The time for denial is over if we don't take substantive, rapid action today. As soon as possible to deal with this crisis, we're going to miss these targets, and we're basically condemning future generations for our own delay. So what does the NDP actually want to do? The first is to actually ban fossil fuel subsidies outright, just stop them. That's $3.3 billion a year that we could redirect to green energy technologies and towards the low carbon economy. The second is to invest heavily in clean energy jobs, retrofitting all new homes to be net zero ready, all structures in Canada, really all buildings by 2050, investing 100% in electrified transit, zero emissions vehicles, basically ensuring that people can get wherever they need to go, whether it's public or in their own car, using green technology. And finally, declaring a climate emergency and establishing a climate bank and an accountability act to track actual progress and pay for these changes.
Thank you, Scott. David has asked for a rebuttal, so 90 seconds to David Haskell on the rebuttal.
Oh, thank you very much. So I want to talk about the science for just a moment. It was brought up. And my party does agree that the temperature is gradually getting warmer, because the best science shows that the temperature began to rise in the 1800s, and we've gone up by about 1 degree Celsius until now. But we're skeptical when activists say that it's exclusively CO2 causing the warming, and that the CO2 will make it dramatically worse. And here's why. The science is also very clear. Levels of CO2 in the atmosphere didn't reach concentrations great enough to affect warming until the 1960s. But the warming we see started in the 1800s. For something to be a cause, it cannot come after the effect. Here's another reason why we really have trouble with the climate alarmism. Various reports of the UN Climate Research Group, the IPCC, clearly state that long-term prediction of future climate states is not possible. If the World Organization that governs and researches global warming says you can't make predictions with any accuracy, what are other parties up to when they say they can make predictions and say the world is on fire and we only have 10 years before doom?
Thank you, David. Scott has requested a rebuttal to David, so we'll have another 90 seconds for Scott Hamilton.
Thank you very much. We don't have to go through a whole history of the discovery of the greenhouse effect with Svante Arrhenius in 1896, track it through Chamberlain, all the developments that happened after World War II. We're not here for a lecture, but what I will do is mention the difference between weather and climate. So what David is referring to is he's talking about weather. It's really hard to predict weather. There's an incredible amount of variables out there. Is it going to rain? What's the humidity going to be like? It's tough to know what the weather is going to be like tomorrow, let alone 2 weeks from now. But right now, we're going to predict climate. All right, you're going to help me. Next August, is it going to be hot or is it going to be cold? It's probably going to be hot, right? That's climate. Next, let's say December 2023, is it going to be hot or is it going to be cold? It's going to be cold. That's climate. The climate is the statistical aggregation of long-term patterns of weather. What happens now, why climate change is such an issue, is that we've started throwing so much crap into the air. CO2, different concentrations of methane, different amounts of water vapor are now having their release because of different feedback loops. But previously, when we used to be able to predict if it's going to be hot or cold at a particular year, because we're throwing so much stuff into the atmosphere, it becomes harder and harder to predict as time goes on. So that's why the climate models that we have been becoming incredibly rigorous. They're becoming more and more powerful and more accurate. And that's why I think conversations like the one we're having now are 2 steps back from where we should be, and they're taking time away from where we should be going.
Thank you. We'll move on to our second question, and Mr. Haskell will get the opportunity to answer first this time. We turn our attention to water. Many Canadians know that our country has the longest coastline in the world. Less well known is that Canada is home to roughly half of the world's lakes and an equivalent volume of the world's freshwater and roughly 1/4 of the world's wetlands. Canada is seeing the impact that industrial development and climate change is having on our water resources. We're seeing the reemergence of pollution hotspots like Lake Erie. And the Insurance Bureau of Canada has noted that climate change, as well as the historic loss of wetlands across Canada due to industrial development, has led to a massive 250% increase in flooding over the past 2 decades, as well as to a reduction in water quality and wildlife habitat. What can the federal government do to work with different sectors, like municipalities and farmers, to reduce both water pollution and the risk of flood events which have been aggravated by industrial development and climate change? David.
Thank you. And you were right in the question to note that industrialization and the loss of wetlands is causing flooding. Absolutely, the science backs that up. But you're wrong to say that increased flooding in Canada is correlated to climate change. The most recent and complete report on precipitation in Canada was just published by scientists with Environment Canada in 2019. It's called Canada's Changing Climate Report. Chapter 4 is called Temperature and Precipitation Across Canada. And here is a direct quote from page 157. Precipitation has increased in every season in northern Canada. This isn't part of the quote, but that's not where the flooding is. Carrying on with the quote. In southern Canada, precipitation has also increased, but the increase is generally not statistically significant. Instead, there has been a decrease. However, a statistically significant decrease in winter precipitation has been observed in British Columbia, Alberta, and Saskatchewan. From this, the evidence is clear. Climate change is not causing significantly greater rainfall, so it can't be leading to the flooding. That's a false claim, unsupported by the data. There is concern over what's happening with our floodplains, but that primarily is a provincial matter.
Thank you, David. Michelle.
The flooding is a matter of grave concern, and I happened to participate as a graphic recorder in 2017 in the first global Amphibious Policy Symposium. So it was an international symposium. It was hosted by University of Waterloo in Canada, and it was organized by the faculties, a couple of faculty from the School of Architecture, right? Faculty from here. And amphibious architecture is you build the architecture, the buildings, the cities, so that they modify it to the climate and you don't change the earth or the waterways. So you're not building dikes and canals, you're changing the architecture. And the design is all there. They've got things as simple as buildings on tethers and buoyancy tanks that go up with the flood and then go back in place. The design is all ready, but the government right now isn't ready with policies or definitions or funding, and so we need government leadership to get caught up. The Green Party is in favor of funding science and universities to have more of this kind of design and research, to have funding available to make the protection. We've also got pollution strategies, a national plastic waste strategy with extended producer responsibility programs for waste, and a national water strategy. So it's time to look after our water and be ready for the effects of climate change.
Thank you, Michelle. And to Scott.
Thank you. So the question is about freshwater management. Well, right behind us is the Grand River, right? And the way it flows from one point to another, we can't treat it piecemeal. Something like a river, you have to treat holistically. You have to deal with the whole package. And that's the same with watersheds in general. You can't just have one area do one thing, another area do another. You have to treat it as a holistic entity. So that's where the Grand River Conservation Authority has come in, right? It's one of the oldest organizations, oldest conservation authorities in Canada, and it's done a great job. But how can we emulate it on a national scale? What the NDP wants to do is put in a national freshwater strategy. It was already put forward by Tracy Ramsey. It was Bill C-439. But the point is to safeguard the whole package, not just have one area do one thing, another do another. Right now we have farmers maybe putting nitrates in, we have cities dumping their waste in. A national freshwater strategy will help water and wastewater infrastructure to deal with climate change and all the pollution runoffs that we're seeing, establish clean water drinking standards, including on First Nations and Indigenous territories. And a national freshwater strategy has also been shown to increase biodiversity and the resilience of ecosystems that exist along these watersheds. In Waterloo Region, 80% of us rely on groundwater sourced water every single day. So this is one of those areas where it can't be municipal, provincial, federal. Every single level of government has to work together, and there's nothing more important to us than water. And this is something I think we can agree on.
Thank you, Scott. And to Brian.
Thank you. And I would like to echo Scott's shout out to the Grand River Conservation Authority. We have an amazing river system here, not just the Grand, but the Speed and the Nith rivers. And they do an incredible job managing that space. I've been there a number of times. We have supported them financially through infrastructure grants, and I believe we are going to have to continue to step up, given that they're facing cuts at the provincial level, which is absolutely incredibly short-sighted. We introduced funding almost right out of the gate for this exact type of issue. $2 billion, which is called the Disaster Mitigation and Adaptation Fund, to help communities prepare for climate change through more resilient infrastructure, and our platform commits to an additional $1 billion. We've committed also in our platform to new measures to support people coping with disaster, including an EI disaster assistance benefit. So imagine you are on the Ottawa River and you have to spend weeks out of your year bagging sand to stop the water from literally flooding your home. We are going to come to the table with assistance for those people that are losing hours at work in order to save their house. We are also looking at infrastructure investments requiring a climate lens, and we need to continue to do that with every single project that we advance. Thank you.
Thank you, Brian. We'll move on to our third question, which is around wilderness conservation. And Michelle, you will get the opportunity to answer first on this one. When asked about what they love most about our country, Canadians point first to natural beauty, wildlife, and spectacular wilderness areas. Yet, we are falling below our international commitments to protect these spaces, and our parks and other protected areas are not funded at the level needed to conserve the diverse plants and animals that live there. A recent study shows that 50% of Canadian wildlife species are in decline. 94% of Canadians value the emotional and physical benefits of spending time in nature. However, 82% say they're concerned that future generations won't have close or easy access to nature. Again, beginning with Michelle, what will you do to protect the quality and quantity of wilderness in Canada?
So this is very near and dear to my heart. I'm an avid canoeist, and I like to hike and cycle and camp in the parks. And I'm really pleased with the Green Party strategy. The first part is renewing the abandoned process of a national forest strategy to focus on ecologically sound and climate-resilient forests. And we can also invoke the federal powers for peace, order, and good government to develop non-commercial forest management with massive tree planting. We're going to need to be ready for increased forest fires, and to be prepared, we need to put measures in place, including water bombers. In addition, the platform of the Green Party includes protecting the species inhabitants. So there's an endangered species recovery plan with an increase in funding, with legislation, tight timelines, and increased funding for Parks Canada so that we can preserve the ecological integrity of the parks. I was in the National Park at Peely Island in the spring, and there's some repair work that has been done as we get better understanding of what we need for resilient forests. The role of government is leadership to create conditions for thriving ecological systems. If we create the conditions, do the assessment, the infrastructure planning, and regulate, the ecological systems will look after themselves and look after us.
Thank you, Michelle. To Scott.
Thank you. In Cambridge, we are blessed with an extremely beautiful natural landscape. And so as your NDP MP, the first thing I would do is commit to conserving and protecting what we currently have. So the NDP is committed to protecting at least 30% of all land, freshwater, and oceans by 2030 in Canada. And that's an extremely large space. Also instituting a national tree planting program to reforest areas that we've lost due to fire, due to logging. But there's one word that I would like to call out here, and that's the word wilderness. It might seem wilderness to certain Western perspectives, but to Indigenous and First Nations, they've had stewardship of this land since time immemorial. So to them, it's not wilderness. That's why, as your NDP MP, I think this is a great opportunity for us to engage full partnership with Indigenous peoples with respect for Indigenous sovereignty, including all of the calls to action mentioned by the Truth and Reconciliation Committee, even number 94. So supporting the creation of Indigenous managed protected areas in Cambridge and around Canada, I think, is a fantastic way to both conserve and protect our environment, as well as to reach out to what we know is a very multicultural area of Cambridge. And finally, deal with pollution where it actually occurs. So one way, for example, involves banning single-use plastics in Canada by 2022. That sounds like it could happen very quickly, but you have to consider how producer responsibility falls into this, ensuring that proper regulations and protections are in place so that the source of that plastic pollution has to follow it throughout its whole life cycle, and people that are polluting are held responsible.
Thank you, Scott. And to Brian.
Thank you. When I was elected in 2015, we inherited an environmental protection system that was frankly gutted by the previous Conservative government. Under the Liberal government, we've gone from protecting less than 1% of our oceans in 2015 to just under 14% in just the past 4 years. Our $1.3 billion investment in protecting nature has put Canada back on track to meet our international goal for protection of biodiversity. 2020 targets, our 2020 targets are 10% for marine and 17% for terrestrial. For land and inland waters, we have gone from 10.5% to 12.6%, and we're stepping up massive new efforts under the Nature Fund. Our platform announced new goals of 25% protection of land for land and 25% protection for oceans by 2025 in this campaign, with a goal of 30% protection for each by 2030. We absolutely have a responsibility moving forward to protect these lands, not just for future generations, but for everybody, for First Nations, for everybody now. We need to protect it, and our government has already focused on how to do that. We've already moved the needle significantly. Thank you.
Thank you, Brian, and to David.
Thank you. I think we all agree up here that protecting Canadian wilderness should be a priority. And I'm going to focus on something that the federal government could fix. In 2017, Parks Canada paid $1 million to commission the New Zealand-based engineering consultancy firm to come in and look at the state of our assets in our national parks. They concluded that Canada's national parks have fallen into disrepair, and it'll take as much as close to $10 billion to repair approximately 40% of its properties. So when I read that report, it made me frustrated. It made me frustrated at how our current government spends money. In the last 4 years, about $2.5 billion of tax money has been sent outside of Canada to other countries to fight CO2 emissions. The extent to which CO2 was directly reduced on account of that $2.5 billion was absolutely negligible. In each of the benefiting countries, CO2 emissions have increased, not decreased, but our national parks continue to crumble. It should be a principle of government that you live within your means and that you also fix what needs to be fixed here at home. A People's Party government will take the money earmarked for the environment and fix the problems here and fix them now.
Thank you, David. Okay, our fourth and final of these questions that are being asked at all of our 100 debates on the environment across Canada. And Scott, I'll start with you on this one for the answer. It's under the header of pollution and toxic substances. Canada has made big strides to improve the health of Canadians and our environment by regulating toxic substances. Legal limits on lead in gasoline, restricting chemicals like DDT and ozone-depleting substances, the Canada-US Acid Rain Agreement, and the phase-out of coal-fired electricity have had an enormous positive impact on the health of Canadians and our environment, saving lives, preventing illnesses, and saving billions of dollars in avoidable health care costs. However, air pollution is still the leading environmental cause of death and illness in Canada, and Canada remains the only Western industrialized nation without legally binding national air pollution standards. In addition, our laws and regulations have not kept pace with emerging threats from newer toxic substances in our environment, including those from pesticides in our food and other harmful chemicals in everyday consumer products. Many of these substances have demonstrated links to cancer, genetic damage, developmental problems, chronic illness, and many other health effects. These effects are often more severe for children and other vulnerable populations. Our overarching toxics law, the Canadian Environmental Protection Act, has not been significantly strengthened in 20 years. The question is, what will you do to ensure that Canadians are better protected from the health and environmental impacts of toxic substances? Will you commit to strengthening the Canadian Environmental Protection Act and the Pest Control Products Act? Scott.
Thank you. So the short answer to that is yes and yes, but I have to talk more. So I'll mention I did something in Cambridge I called a listening tour. I think politicians talk too much, so I went around and actually listened to a bunch of groups. The first one I listened to was called the Blue Dot Movement of Waterloo, and I signed a pledge to sign on to what is known as an Environmental Bill of Rights. And this was first put forward in government by NDP MP Linda Duncan. It was Bill C-438. But what it does is basically protect Canadian citizens by securing clean air, clean soil, and clean water. And Canada is one of the very few nations in the world that's industrialized that doesn't actually have an Environmental Bill of Rights. So the first thing I would do as an NDP MP to fight, to answer your question, to fight against toxic substances and pesticides is to ensure this act is passed in Parliament, therefore protecting all of us. But on top of that, strengthening and modernizing the Canadian Environmental Protection Act by focusing on, like you mentioned, tougher regulations on those emitting pesticides, plastics, chemicals into our water systems. I think that we can all agree that if we do not regulate some companies, they have a tendency to put things into products that are not at the benefit of the overall Canadian population, but might benefit shareholders. So we need something to protect us as consumers from that top-down power, and I'm willing to fight for all of us on behalf of that.
Thank you, Scott. And to Brian.
Thank you. The Canadian Environmental Protection Act absolutely needs to be reviewed and renewed. And that is why our party is committed right in our platform to introduce a bill as soon as possible. But let's step back a minute, because we have actually done quite a bit over the last 4 years. And we've committed to eliminating coal by 2030, something that will lead to a major reduction in mercury emissions, one of the most toxic substances. Our investments in green infrastructure will help reduce pollution that's made its way into not just the airways, but also water. Our plan to ban single-use plastics means less microplastics in our environment, water sources, and food sources. In fact, one of the first things we did was ban microbeads in cosmetics and soaps because of the impact those were having on our fish habitat. It was a Liberal government that banned the import, sale, use, and export of asbestos. Believe it or not, asbestos was still being produced. We were the second largest producer of asbestos in the world up until last December. And we need to continue down that road. We need to focus on things that we can do immediately and ensure that both the air and our water are clean moving forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Brian. And to David.
Thank you. So we are a brand new party, and often we are perhaps considered to be a fiscally conservative party and maybe a party of business. But we are a mix of people, a very diverse mix of people who want to do what is best for Canadians. And because of that, that means where money needs to be spent, we will spend it. I want to just give you a precedent for that so you know when I say that we'll follow the science and we'll do what needs to be done to protect Canadians, that it's the truth. Just recently, a few weeks ago, we put out our policy for veterans. We ensured that the level of pension that a veteran gets, even if they're disabled in conflict situations, returned to the 2006 level. It had been cut by the government, our current government, so that many veterans couldn't even afford to replace prosthetic legs. Now, we are promising to increase that funding because it is important to make sure you spend money when it will benefit Canadians. So in terms of spending money, the People's Party wants to do this for the environment. We're going to focus on clean air, clean water, and our first priority is getting clean water to Indigenous communities. Thank you.
Thank you, David. I know, I'm trying to think. Yeah, we'll get the rebuttal after.
No, I didn't get to go yet.
I know. I'm trying to determine which way we have to. Do we do the rebuttal first? What did we do the first time around? I think we do the rebuttal first and then get to Michelle.
So
I apologize. Yeah, I will. I promise I won't forget you. I should allow the rebuttal right after the.
I
statement.
can't. I have
90
to admit,
seconds.
I can't believe I'm doing a rebuttal on veterans at an environmental debate, but I think it has to be said because there's a lot of inaccuracies there. We've actually invested over $10.25 billion over the past 4 years into better support for services for veterans and families. The The Conservatives closed 9 veterans offices. We've opened up every single one of them. We've hired over 700 new staff for Veterans Affairs to reduce wait times, improve service, increase personalized support for veterans and their families, and ensure quality care for veterans and their families. We increased the compensation available to veterans for pain and injuries by over $45,000, and we reinstated the pension for life, which gives veterans with illnesses and injuries monthly tax-free pension for life. Thank you.
Okay, and David would like a mini rebuttal of 30 seconds.
If you will recall from the media, Justin Trudeau was at a press conference, and a veteran said to him, "Do you have money to help me because you have cut my pension almost in half?" And Justin Trudeau said, "We do not have money for you." And it was just when he'd made the $10 million payout to Omar Khadr instead of trying to battle. I'm sorry, but Canadians care about this, Brian. And I don't think you should be laughing at veterans. Thank you.
All right. I'm just going to, Michelle, before you answer the question, actually restate it so that we can all come back to where we began on this. So we had been talking about pollution and toxic substances, and the question, Michelle, that you will now have 90 seconds to address is as follows. What will you do to ensure that Canadians are better protected from the health and environmental impacts of toxic substances? And will you commit to strengthening the Canadian Environmental Protection Act and the Pest Control Products Act?
Yes, and yes. And in addition, we're going to review and expand the National Pesticides Monitoring and Surveillance Act, move the targets down. We're going to ban those pesticides that are killing the bees and pollinators. And also introduce a precautionary principle in any decisions for approval of products where the risk is of irreversible harm, so that we switch the onus. And unless there's proof of safety, we're going to withhold approval, so that the maybe isn't on the risk of health effects. Banning toxic ingredients in personal care products, and creating an adverse effects reporting database for doctors and emergency rooms, so we start really tracking the health impacts. The reality is that health effects of the environment affect disproportionately vulnerable people, and I'm talking about environmental racism. I'm talking about places like Grassy Narrows. I'm talking about the water conditions. And it's not just northern reserves. I was actually shocked to discover that there's a water advisory at Six Nations. So they had money for a new treatment center for their water, but the water lines are outdated. And one of the things that needs to happen is we need to have the same powers the municipalities have and resources to look after water for First Nations leaders, because that's part of the reason why we've had the 20-year problem. So those are some of the things we would do to look after the environment.
Thank you, Michelle. Okay, that concludes the first part of our debate here tonight. We're going to take a 10-minute break. When we come back, we'll have 3 more questions the candidates have seen in advance, which are specific to our community, and then the option for your questions to be answered. So if you have not yet dropped anything in the green bin, you can see it at the top of the stairs here when you're heading out for a break. We'll reconvene in 10 minutes. Okay, thank you very much, and thank you again for being such an orderly group as well. Usually after a break like that, it's difficult to corral everybody back into the room, but you've done so very swiftly, which means we can continue. And I think that also points to how good the discussion has been so far and how interested we are in hearing about it. I just wanted to quickly clarify one point of order with our rebuttal and mini response cards that we have at the table. Once a candidate uses a rebuttal card, they must surrender it. They only have 2 at their disposal, and the mini response cards are specifically 30 seconds, so it's less than the other answers, but only when another candidate names you or your party directly in their answer. That's what the mini response is designed for. So I just want to make sure we're all clear on those rules. The rebuttal at any point, but you only have 2 of them to use. The mini response, 30 seconds, but only when you have been named or your party has been directly named by another candidate. Let's move on now to our 3 local questions for the 100 debates on the environment specific to us here in the region. And I believe we're back to Brian for starting on the answers this time. Each candidate will again have that 90 seconds. Under transition, to mitigate climate change, Canada will need to transition towards a decarbonized economy. The Paris Agreement 2015, which Canada signed, involves, quote, taking into account the imperatives of a just transition of the workforce and the creation of decent work and quality jobs in accordance with nationally defined development priorities. The question is, how will you ensure the development and implementation of a just transition strategy for Canada? How will you approach the development of green jobs and green tech innovation across Canada? And through what mechanisms will you support workers and their communities through this transition? We'll begin with Brian May.
Our government is fighting climate change with the most responsible and realistic plan. We're moving towards a net zero future. In order for us to reach this goal by 2050, we're going to set legally binding milestones every 5 years to get us there. We will set them by consulting with Canadians, including scientists, economists, and experts, to ensure we're on the right path. We're going to exceed the 2030 goal that Canada has set by introducing new carbon-reducing measures. We will also be ensuring that energy workers and communities that depend on energy revenue will be protected through our Just Transition Act, which will provide training and supports to help them get new jobs in the clean economy. We know that we can never succeed as a country if we leave people behind. In order to secure and get the support of all Canadians, we need to provide the transition that is truly just. In addition, every single dollar that we earn from the Trans Mountain expansion will be put into the transition to clean energy. This project, which is already accounted for in our emissions plan, will actually help to fund the transition that we need. This will generate $500 million a year from the sale of the pipeline, and the sale of the pipeline itself will go into investments in clean technologies. Thank you.
Thank you, Brian, and to David.
The question put to us was, what will we do to help transition into the green economy? So essentially, what will we do to ensure those companies and those people in the green industries are taken care of? A People's Party government won't pick winners and losers when it comes to businesses. We need to learn from the disastrous effect of the past. Canadian economists have shown a strong correlation between repeated government favoritism at the corporate level and lower levels of innovation, and in some cases, increased corruption. But we are going to treat all businesses fairly to make sure any business, green or any other type, prosper and do well. We'll do that first by lowering business tax for all businesses from 15% down to 10%. We're also going to eliminate trade tariff barriers between provinces to increase trade. We're also going to work with small and medium-sized businesses through the Ministry of International Trade to help them participate in more export, because currently only 4% of medium and small businesses are doing export compared to 20% of other G7 nations. Lower taxes, easier internal trade, and greater access to international trade will produce more jobs overall, including green jobs. Thank you.
Thank you, David, and to Michelle.
Thank you, and I'm delighted to answer the question that was asked, which was, as we transition to a green economy, how are we going to make sure it's just and fair to workers? So the Green Party platform has 3 priorities about that. First of all, to protect workers in transition from fossil fuels. Part of that is meeting with local communities to have local priorities and make sure that part of the funding goes into local infrastructure programs. We'd also look at income protection, job guarantees, training, and resettlement. Remember, if we stop subsidizing oil and gas, we've got billions and billions of dollars to actually look after Canadian workers. We'd set up a task force to keep track of this. We'd embed transition principles in legislative and regulation. How is this going to affect the workers? And to make sure that there's a just transition plan, we have a lead minister in the cabinet in charge of that. So that's the first one. The second one is ensuring jobs in the green economy. So we'd create a Canadian Sustainable Generation Fund that would train trade apprenticeships, education in energy efficiency, training for emerging technologies, and creative and care economies. That's artists and doctors and nurses and early childhood educators. In addition, the Green Party is in favor of a guaranteed livable income, which looks after all Canadians. It was recommended in the Marsh Report in the 1940s, 1960s, MacDonald Commission. It's far more efficient, and it's time.
Thank you, Michelle. And to Scott.
Thank you. So as a study by the CBC just released, the NDP's plan would actually create more than 300,000 jobs across Canada, and these would all be 300,000 jobs in a low-carbon future. If the NDP is known for one thing, it's supporting workers. Dedicated employment support, including EI benefits, retraining, job placement services, investments to help communities thrive. The whole point of a just transition is that someone who is working in a fossil fuel economy can have the skills, the training, and the placement in a new job so that their families, their communities don't suffer. And that's something that myself as your MP, the NDP as a party places a great deal of importance on. There's a problem, however, where many studies show that in any system where you switch from one type of work to another, it risks replicating the same underlying social dynamics that could include stigmatization, marginalization, racial discrimination. So a big part of the NDP's platform is to ensure that no worker and no person is left behind. So that's including Indigenous Canadians, racialized Canadians, LGBTQ2+. All of these are included in what's our version of a Green New Deal, because these are essential components of every workforce. If we don't begin with these social goals, then we risk replicating them in the future. You know what, I'll leave it at that.
Thank you very much, Scott. Our second question is around zero-emission vehicles, and David, you will have the first opportunity to answer.
Thank you.
The United Nations has said that we have just 11 years to prevent... Yeah, we have to get to the question. I know you got to see them before.
Sorry, I know it. You don't. I apologize.
The United Nations has said that we have just 11 years to prevent irreversible damage from climate change and therefore must drastically reduce greenhouse gas emissions. According to Natural Resources Canada, the transportation sector produced the greatest amount of greenhouse gas emissions in Canada in 2016. According to Climate Action Waterloo Region, the transportation sector was the largest producer of CO2 emissions, a greenhouse gas, in the region in 2015, accounting for 49% and growing. To the question, there are more and more vehicles on the market which produce zero greenhouse gas emissions. Will you support the introduction of regulations requiring vehicle manufacturers to sell an increasing percentage of their fleet as zero-emission vehicles in Canada? And will you support taking steps to make these vehicles more affordable in Canada to help Canadians transition to a zero-emission vehicle? David.
So when we can be convinced that they will actually accomplish what they are said to accomplish, then we may consider it. But I'm often confused by the vocal enthusiasm for zero-emission vehicles, what we call electric cars. They're said to be superior to gas-guzzling machines. What's often lost on the general public is that most green technologies in general often aren't that green once you do the math. Several recent studies have shown that electric cars most often have a higher carbon footprint than gasoline-powered cars, and the problem is in the manufacturing. In terms of the emissions that come from the processing of manufacturing, electric cars are far worse than gas-powered cars. In fact, the total embedded CO2 for the making of a gasoline-powered car is just 5.6 tons. By contrast, it takes 8.8 tons to make an electric vehicle, and the battery accounts for nearly half of that. Electric vehicles can only make a difference on the carbon front, that is, they're only better than gas if they are powered by low-carbon electricity. and it has to be over their entire lifetime. But here's the problem. Other studies show low carbon electricity, the electricity that comes from hydro or nuclear, is much more rare. But most electricity in North America is produced through fossil fuels. Very often across North America, gas-powered cars have a lower carbon footprint.
Thank you, David. And to Michelle.
So those are not actually arguments for why not to do it. They are arguments for how to do it better. And we have ways of doing it better. For example, the Green Party is advocating a Canadian grid strategy. So basically, it looks after the electricity grid so that there aren't gaps between Manitoba and Western Ontario or between New Brunswick and Nova Scotia. And also making sure that we get the electricity onto non-renewable, to the renewables, away from non-renewables to renewables by 2030. So that kind of takes care of a big part of that argument. The Green Party is in favor of a national transportation strategy, which would look at electric vehicles and also at rail. And one of the advantages of increasing rail service is you can have light rail, electric buses, look after VIA. That has the impact of including service for rural and remote areas at affordable rates. And that answers one of the recommendations of the inquiry for the missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls, that transportation issues. On electric vehicles, we would ban the sale of internal combustion engine passenger vehicles by 2030, exempt new and used electric and zero emission vehicles from federal sales tax right away, and expand charging stations, including having them at all federal buildings, like the post office.
Thank you, Michelle. And on to Scott.
Thank you. So yes, on all counts, zero emission cars are the wave of the future. You don't have to take my word for it. You can actually look to automotive manufacturers. In the United States, General Motors, Volkswagen, Volvo, they're not even building hybrid cars anymore for that market. They're just going all electric because they see that's the way the global market is heading. Producing renewable energy is becoming cheaper and cheaper and cheaper every single day, while producing fossil fuel energy is actually becoming more and more expensive as the quality of fossil fuels disappears. So you have to go to very noxious sources like our own tar sands. So what the NDP would do, again, we are the party of supporting industry, local work. Cambridge is an automotive town, right? Toyota is here. So the Cambridge I envision is that we not only produce the best electric vehicles in North America, but we produce the batteries, we build the infrastructure for grids, for charging stations, for light rail transit, for trains across the country. This is where the global economy is heading. Specifically in terms of automotives, what we can look at is a national automotive strategy that meets with labor and the companies involved to look at domestic procurement, so using local Canadian products for local Canadian jobs. That is a way to ensure that our neighbors, our family members have jobs producing the electric cars and the low carbon technologies of the future. We're procuring domestically, or we're using Canadian parts, and we're selling these technologies ourselves. Because if we don't tap into this trend right now, then we will be buying them from someone else in 15 years. So let's start now.
Thank you, Scott. And to Brian.
Thank you. Many of you in this room tonight may not know this, but I actually chair the Auto Caucus in Ottawa. This is a group of lawmakers who follow auto issues very, very closely. These jobs, as has been stated, are obviously very critical to this riding. We have been instrumental in pressuring the department to go fully into a ZEV strategy. Now, your question, sir, was do I support the forced percentage of all fleets being ZEV? No, I do not. And frankly, because that does not work to transition the manufacturers. And it would immediately be challenged in court, and the government would lose that case. What we do, and what our government has already done, is support growth of ZEV sales through incentives encouraging buyers to get these vehicles. And we know that people want them. We have seen sales increase dramatically after we brought back the $5,000 incentive after the Ford government canceled it very foolishly. We've also invested heavily in infrastructure for charging stations and other types of ZEV refueling stations. And we're going to keep building them. Communities will transition into using more ZEVs with federal investments in public transit and help for school boards to purchase 5,000 zero-emission buses, as well as support for the conversion of business fleets, including taxis, courier companies, trucking companies, and industrial vehicles. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Brian. Okay, to our third and final local question before we get to the three audience questions here this evening. And Michelle, we will come to you first for an answer on this question around subsidies and investments in clean energy. A shift to clean energy technology, reducing air pollution and greenhouse gases, promises tremendous economic and health benefits to Canadians. Research by the Conference Board of Canada highlights Canada's competitive edge in wind and solar power, energy-efficient turbines, and waste management. The United Nations Environment Program predicts that global trade in environmental goods is projected to grow to US $2.3 trillion. That's $2.3 trillion US dollars by 2020. Considering these opportunities and benefits for Canadians, will you end all public financing of the greenhouse gas intensive fossil fuel industry? If so, when? And how will you ensure that public financing is directed towards supporting the development of and transition to clean energy technology and environmental goods?
The Green Party has been very vocal for a long time that we need to keep fossil fuels in the ground. So we would eliminate fossil fuel subsidies. That's several $billion a year that would be saved. Have a climate change act so that we would have 60% of 2005 emissions by 2030, net zero by 2050. No new pipelines, no new gas drilling or mining, no fracking, cancel the Trans Mountain Pipeline. That's going to save us a lot of money, and that money, so instead of having subsidies and money that goes into the industries we don't want, that actually make the planet harder to live in, or might poison us, we're going to direct that money to a Canadian grid strategy and renewable energy transition. So I talked about ramping up renewable electricity. There would be other investments for the green economy. And what we need to have is we need to have government leadership, businesses ready. To some extent, business has been taking a lead in some areas, and it's time for the government to pick up the leadership, and the Green Party's got a plan to do that.
Thank you, Michelle. And to Scott.
Thank you. Yeah, this is an extremely serious crisis. Drastic action has to be taken immediately. So we stop all fossil fuel subsidies. That's $3.3 billion per year on average. Full stop. They're done. If you look at something like the TMX pipeline, is that a good investment? $4.5 billion to purchase it, $10 billion approximately for the upgrades. So right now you're looking at $15 billion. You make $500 million a year back on that. So you're still going to be paying off that tar sands pipeline for about 30 years. So if we are still dependent on fossil fuel technologies and tar sands 30 years from now, we're in serious trouble. So the only thing we can do is transition to a low carbon economy if we want to give our grandchildren and great-grandchildren the future they deserve. So how does the NDP want to do that? First thing is that you need some type of body within the government to lend money to businesses and organizations that want to embark on green industry. So to establish a climate bank with a strictly stated mandate to boost investment in renewable energy, low carbon technologies, and a climate accountability office that actually holds Canadian companies and the government itself to the standards that it agrees on in international agreements, the promises that are made to actually follow the low carbon future that we all know is necessary. This is what it looks like to build the future we want. We need a quick and immediate transition. We have to start now, and that's what I would be willing to push for us, for all of us as your MP.
Thank you, Scott. And to Brian.
Our plan is to provide a strong and direct incentive for businesses to get building green. For starters, we are slashing the corporate taxes of any businesses that develops technologies or manufactures products that have zero emissions. We want this technology developed here in Canada so that we can benefit from it. We know the market for this technology is already massive and growing every day. The market is going to be $2.5 trillion by 2022. We've always operated on the knowledge that the environment and the economy need to go hand in hand. These lower taxes will create a strong incentive for businesses to set up shop here, design here, build here, and make us a world leader in this technology. And yes, we are committed to phasing out all fossil fuel subsidies by 2025, and we are on track to do so. In fact, 8 out of 9 of the fossil fuel subsidies are already being phased out. What is often overlooked when they lump all of these subsidies together are the northern and remote Indigenous communities who receive a subsidy because they still rely on diesel. This isn't a subsidy for fossil fuels. It's a subsidy to help these communities survive because other options are coming, but not up and running yet, and that subsidy still has a role to play. Thank you.
Michelle would like a rebuttal.
Oh, it's okay.
Oh, okay.
Something with veterans?
No, I was going to talk about my granddaughter.
That works too.
Okay, and to David, last word on investments in clean energy.
Thank you. So overall, the key principle of the People's Party is that we aren't going to give government handouts to anyone. So we will not give them to the oil industry, and we also won't give them to the green industry. History is also clear that government subsidies often don't end up in the hands of the most deserving company, but instead in the hands of the most well-connected company, the company that gives the most to government campaign funds. We've seen evidence of that just recently. As I said earlier, we'll create a business environment that's favorable to all businesses. And since we're talking about subsidies, I think it's important to remember the history of our province. Let's remember what happened when the Liberal government of Kathleen Wynne gave subsidies to green energy producers here. It created the highest prices for electricity in North America, and it added $30 billion to the standing debt of Ontario. Here's what the provincial auditor, Bonnie Lysyk, showed regarding the economic harm brought by subsidizing green energy in Ontario. Here is her finding in her 2016 report. Wind, solar, and bioenergy account for 6.3% of total electricity generated in the province, but they now make up 16.3% of the total generation cost to the consumer. What I'm trying to say is we should learn the lesson from history, and when we talk about subsidy, it just hasn't worked out. Thank you.
Thank you, David. Okay, it's now time for us to move on to questions that were posed by you here in our audience this evening. Again, the same format continues. Each candidate will get 90 seconds. Everybody still has at least one rebuttal should they choose to use it. I'll continue with the order that we've been going in. So, Scott, you're going to get the first opportunity for an answer on this question posed by our audience. Overconsumption, waste, and the culture of consumerism are arguably the greatest contributors to environmental decay worldwide. No party addresses this issue. What are your thoughts and plans to address this problem locally, nationally, and on the international stage?
Thank you. So this question deals a lot with affluence, the fact that Canada, if you look at textiles, for example, clothing, we lead the world in pretty much buying stuff and throwing it out. It's sad, but it's true. What we need to do is, when we look at these global issues, take something like climate change, right? We look at a number like everyone knows, 1.5 degrees, 2 degrees. We know what those numbers are. But how do you boil that down to your own backyard, to your own house, to getting into your car in the morning? The difficulty that I find with whether it's consumption or whether it's climate change, for example, is that when we have global metrics, we need politicians, we need policymakers, we need community leaders to make them relevant to us on the ground level. So in Cambridge, for example, we might not, or some of our neighbors might not take action hearing about a 2 degrees Celsius rise in temperature. But if they find out that now in February their temperature will rise 3 degrees, the average winter temperature will go up above zero, they're not going to be able to build a shinny rink for their kids, all of a sudden priorities can change. So whether it's climate change or consumption, what I would want to do is institute more programs that actually deal with what happens on the ground locally in different municipalities, provinces, and how those factor up to basically affect us federally. Because otherwise I'm worried that we can get lost dealing with global and federal metrics. We need to bring it back home, focus on how does this affect Cambridge and what can each of us do to make a difference, and that will add up to greater things.
Thank you, Scott. And to Brian.
Thank you. And this is not a new problem. This is something that Canada has faced for a very long time. I remember being in high school reading the statistics that we consume more per capita than any other country in the world. And I think that one of the absolute best resources that we have on this issue is frankly sitting in the very front row, and I'm going to call her out. We have actually the organizer of our climate strike here, and that was just a few days ago. I believe the youth are seized with this issue. They are laser focused on finding solutions moving forward, and they are prepared. When I talk to youth across the city, across this country, they are prepared to make sacrifices to make a difference. I know it's cliche to say that youth are our strongest resource, but on this issue, they are going to have to solve this problem. They are going to have to, and because quite frankly, if not, they're the ones that are going to have to deal with it. Thank you.
Thank you, Brian. And to David.
The question was about overconsumption. And currently, the federal government has a $750 billion debt. Each year, we pay $30 billion on that debt. It's just thrown away in interest. Everyone up here at this table, except for me, has made promises for lavish spending in the billions. My government won't. And you might not vote for me because of that. In fact, we are going to be a government of restraint. We'll live within our means. We'll balance the budget in 2 years. If we're looking at our society and we see overconsumption, perhaps it's because the government is setting the example. Maybe it's time we had a government that lived within its means and said that overconsumption has to stop and that we actually have to focus on our future. Because the new programs that are being promised by each of these candidates, it means that something will be lost for your children because the economy cannot continue like this. Thank you.
Thank you, David. And Michelle.
So I'm going to rebut the question because part of it said that no party was dealing with this. And in fact, the Green Party platform dealing with consumer protection exactly focuses on that. So we've looked at the current economy with it's basically an easy credit gray economy, over expanding mass consumption, production, waste systems, and disposability, a throwaway culture. And the Green Party analysis says this undermines individual and family security. So we're saying, hey, no more drop the hands-off approach. The green economy will all be about durability, repair, and protection from predatory practices. So a right to repair legislation so that replacement parts, software, tool diagnosis are maintained for a fair price. Imagine that. You could fix your cell phone instead of having to replace it. Limit credit card rates to maximum of 10% above the Bank of Canada prime. So I do not want to leave this for my granddaughter to fix. I do not want to leave this Gracie to fix. I think we need to get started on it right away, and this runaway consumer society where everything's disposable is part of our problem. Things need to change.
Thank you, Michelle. Our next audience question, and Brian, you will have the first opportunity to answer here. Would you be willing to nationalize the energy industry and treat it as a public good?
So we bought a pipeline. We bought a pipeline because we understood the absolute necessity to do two things. One, to make sure that our energy sector is strong and continues to be strong in Canada, but also that it's done right, that we focus on not just the environment, but also the rights of Indigenous in Canada. Do I believe in nationalizing the entire energy industry? No, I don't believe that that is a realistic plan moving forward at this time. I don't. What we have to look at is how are we going to move forward? We need to have a plan. And the plan that we have put into place, that has been in place for 4 years, is a transition plan. We know that the need for not just fossil fuels for cars, but the oil for plastics that pretty much everybody right now in this room has on their person in some way, shape, or form. This is something that is going to be needed long into the future. And Canada, unlike anywhere else in the world, we can focus on the environment, we can focus on First Nations, and we can do it better. We have an obligation to deal with our resources in a sustainable way, and our focus, things like Bill C-69, has set forth a path that it will allow us to do that. Thank you.
Thank you, Brian, and to David.
Will a People's Party government nationalize the energy industry to treat it as a public good? Absolutely not. Anytime you have a monopoly, what you see is it leads to a lack of innovation and higher cost. Right now, we have a monopoly going on dairy, eggs, and poultry, and we are paying $600 more a year. And this negatively affects the poor most of all. The People's Party government will get rid of that system of supply management, which is a monopoly, a nationalized monopoly. Also, on cell phones, we have the major companies that are operating as monopolies. And that's why our cell phone bills are so high. We're going to break that monopoly. We are about free enterprise and the good for all Canadians. So no, we don't want to nationalize the energy industry because we have example after example of how that harms Canadians.
Thank you, David, and to Michelle.
So the Green Party is not in favor of nationalizing the energy industry. We don't actually, the way it's run right now, it's not that good. And we don't think the government should be in the business of buying pipelines. What the Green Party is in favor of is recognizing that there are public goods and protecting them as a human right. Air, water, put it in the charter. It would make a difference. It's not there now. It's protected in countries in Europe. It's protected, I believe, in Bolivia, but not in Canada. So recognize the public goods that are public goods. Recognize that people should pay for resources like water, and that we need to really cost a resource like using carbon. So rather than the weak and ineffectual liberal carbon tax, the Green Party is in favor of a revenue-neutral carbon fee at source. And that revenue-neutral means the government doesn't keep that money. All of the dividends go back to Canadians. It actually helps people who are living at the lower levels, people who are living in poverty, because they're not going to use up the carbons, they're going to have more money, and they invested in the economy because they buy shoes for their children. So basically, what the Green Party is in favor of is things like a Canadian grid strategy, a national transportation strategy, and a climate infrastructure bank.
Thank you, Michelle, and to Scott.
Thank you. So I think we have to look at what is the role of the state versus the role of a company. Right, the role of a company is generally to make profit and look after its shareholders. The role of a state is ultimately to protect people, to provide physical security from external and internal threats, and human security, which is good jobs, a safe environment, a healthy place to raise your kids, your family, and grow old. So I don't know if we're thrown back to the old school days of Petro-Canada here in terms of nationalizing the energy industry, but echoing Michelle, a public good is exactly what is protected in the NDP's Environmental Bill of Rights. So that's the first thing to bring in. If we're going to bring in a public good, Let's enshrine it in legislation and ensure that any corporation that wants to do business in Canada can't take advantage of the people that make up this country. That's what the state has to do. It has to protect us. Sometimes it doesn't do a great job, but we can't bank on multinational corporations protecting Canadian consumers, Canadian workers, protecting our pensions, and looking after our families. Take an example, right? Almost $14 billion given to General Motors and Chrysler, right? Those $14 billion of taxpayer money. What happened to that? It's gone, right? The companies bailed. 2,300 workers lost their jobs in Oshawa. There was $3 billion of that I think was hidden in an omnibus bill that was just written off and given away. What if we would have put that $14 billion towards low carbon jobs, technologies, industries that we could build upon as a community? So there's a whole pile of stuff in the NDP platform because it's like a phone book. But I'll just mention quickly, smart community planning to reduce the number of fossil fuel cars on the road, and modernizing and expanding public transit to make sure it is zero emissions.
Thank you, Scott. Brian had requested a rebuttal. I just missed it after Michelle's statement. I apologize.
That's okay. We'll get the red flags like they have in
That's right.
football.
It was like the snap got off before the red flag hit the ground.
I'm
Sorry.
No,
this
it's
is
a
rebuttal.
yeah,
Yeah,
rebuttal.
90 seconds.
I can't believe I'm actually doing this because I was a little surprised there when Michelle referred to it as a carbon tax. I thought maybe she was channeling the individual who isn't here tonight. But to be honest, we need to make something very clear here. The price on pollution that we have in Ontario is going back to consumers. And I'm sorry, Michelle, but it sounded like you were saying that wasn't the case. We know that in a number of experts all around the world agree this is the best way to help reduce emissions. We basically put a price on pollution for those that are polluting, and we actually take that revenue and give it back to residents through a tax benefit, through a tax credit. Now, we had a really long conversation about actually sending checks to everybody, because when I talk to people at the doors, they don't even realize that they got that credit. It's buried in their taxes. Their accountant didn't necessarily explain that to them, but they received it. And the average family of four is receiving $307 tax credit. Now, that same family, the experts suggest that it's $267, the increase that it's going to cost them. Well, they're getting more back than they're actually going to end up paying, and they get it ahead of time. They get it at the beginning of the year. The reason we didn't do the checks is, frankly, it was going to cost nearly $8 million to do it. We were being fiscally responsible, and we did. It would have been easier to do it. It would have been better for us from a communications perspective, but we took the best path given the public that we're responsible for the public purse. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Brian. Michelle was named in that response. 30-second mini response for you.
Sure. Brian, I'll take back the word tax, and I will just emphasize the weak and ineffective Liberal carbon plan. And in order to emphasize that what we really need is a revenue-neutral carbon fee at source that applies everywhere, and a dividend. I think it's better.
Thank you, Michelle. We have one more question from the audience, and David, you will be permitted first answer on this one. Local action is a conduit for our global contribution towards ecosystem health and ultimately combating the impacts of climate change. What local actions are you willing to support as MP? David.
The People's Party is very determined to respect the Constitution. That is to say, over the decades, the federal government has intruded into the jurisdiction of the provinces. This has caused confusion. It's also caused greater cost. So local action, with me as an MP, it doesn't make sense. Personally, I'll recycle. I mean, in my own home, I'll do what I can to reduce, reuse, and recycle. But as a federal MP, it's not a municipal issue. It's not a provincial issue. I'm going to deal with federal issues. So locally, I can't make a promise that's out of my jurisdiction. Sorry.
Thank you, David. Michelle?
So the Green Party, many of our transition plans start with local consultation, and this is maybe a good time to introduce what well, I'm biased, but I think it's a brilliant idea of renewing our federalism in terms of intergovernmental collaboration, and that's the Council of Canadian Governments. So this would be a model of collaborative federalism where you'd have representatives of the provinces, the territories, municipalities, so some big city mayors, some medium city mayors, some rural mayors, and also we would have Indigenous peoples at the table. So it's going to include representatives right across and include Indigenous governments. So Australia does something like this. And you could think of the chamber that's now the Senate and imagine this Council of Canadian Government, because some of the time the municipalities don't get to talk to the federal government. There's some cool things about the National Housing Strategy where some money in the spring of 2019 actually went directly to municipalities. Thank you, Brian. But we could do a better job with that. And with this kind of Council of Canadian Governments, it allows an opportunity for collaboration that kind of side cuts the possibility that some provincial premiers may not like a particular prime minister. I'm not saying he's not lovely, but this would get rid of those tensions. So one way to have the local collaboration would be some electoral reform.
Thank you, Michelle. And over to you, Scott.
Thank you. I've already talked a lot about my vision for Cambridge as being a powerhouse when it comes to low-income technologies, developing the infrastructure that will be used around the world. To me, locally, we have the rail, we have the highways, we have the airports, we have the universities. I think we have just schools like this, all the potential in the world to be a leader, not just in Ontario and Canada, but in the world, in developing the green technologies of the future. What I really think we do need, though, and this comes through knocking on maybe thousands, I don't know, well, probably over 10,000 doors in the past 10 months, a lot of people just don't know the scale of the crisis and the scale of the problem. They're busy, they're struggling with rent, they've got kids, they don't have the luxury or time sometimes to concern themselves with important issues like climate change, even though it is the most important issue, I think, that we're confronting. So what I would do as an MP would be to help make people aware of the crisis that we're facing. Again, if you ask someone 2 degrees, what does it mean? They might be able to tell you. If you ask someone, what's it going to be like in your backyard in 2050? They're probably not going to be able to tell you. Then you can tell them, well, in 2050, according to the actual climate models that they've developed at Wilfrid Laurier, the extreme heat warnings are going to last almost the whole summer. So how are you going to send your kids or your grandkids outside to play soccer in that? Suddenly, people become a lot more concerned. They take action. They pressure their local representative, their provincial, their federal, and things can get done across party lines and all levels of government, because democracy in that sense still works if people pressure their local representatives over issues that matter.
Thank you, Scott. And to Brian.
Thank you. We actually have an incredible track record when it comes to working locally, whether that's with the municipalities or with the provinces. At the provincial level, very quickly, one of the very first things we did was we sat down with the provinces for what was probably the first time in almost a decade, and we actually brought back, with their help, the National Health Accord. That was allowed to die on the vines in 2015 by the previous government. We saw there was an appetite there to continue to work together. And we went back to the table with them very shortly after and reestablished, or actually doubled, the contributions for the Canadian pension plan, which hadn't been touched in far too long. We then followed that up with a national housing strategy, which every single province has signed on to. And that commitment and the work that's being done there is, as Michelle mentioned, is we're seeing the fruits of that labor right here in this riding. And also, we've developed with nine provinces and territories the Low Carbon Leadership Fund, and this is investing in 44 programs totaling $819 million and will reduce emissions and clean growth. Now that's at the provincial level. At the local level, I will simply say this. I have done more consultations and been more available to the people of this riding than any other member of Parliament in this riding's history. That is just simply a fact. And I will continue to do that and be available to listen and to work together on the solutions that we need moving forward.
Brian, thank you very much. That concludes our opportunity for questions and answers this evening. So all that remains is concluding remarks from each of our candidates. We will continue in the same order that we have been operating under throughout the evening. So that means, Michelle, I will turn to you to begin with concluding remarks. Each candidate has 2 minutes for their closing remarks this evening.
So I'm asking you to vote for me, to vote green. We are offering honest, ethical, caring leadership, honest about what we are facing and the challenges and changes we need to make, ethical in terms of being grounded in principles and committed to public good, and prepared to make transition to a sustainable, caring society. The Green Party values are about ecological wisdom, sustainability, social justice, nonviolence, respect for diversity, and participatory democracy. And it's time to interrupt politics as usual and make a dramatic change of course. The Green Party is the party for social innovation. That's how we solve complex problems. The environmental crisis, climate crisis, it's a complex problem. And the Green Party is ready to roll up our sleeves, and I'm ready to get working for you. So I'm asking you, vote your values, vote green.
Thank you, Michelle, and to Scott.
Thank you. So over the past 10 months since I've been nominated, I've now knocked on thousands of doors across Cambridge. I've listened to community leaders, and I've listened to some of you in this room as well. And I do invite you to check this out for yourself on my website. It's scotthamiltoncambridge.ca, but there you'll actually find blogs that I've written, about 35 interviews I've conducted with members of the community, many of them in low-carbon industries, because I think it's important that you know your local MP is listening, that they have a firm grasp of local dynamics on the ground, and that they can take your voice from Cambridge to Ottawa, because that's still the way our democracy should work. But primarily when I'm knocking on doors, I'm hearing two things across our riding. And the first is frustration. Frustration and anger with our two big political parties that tend to do a lot of talking and little walking. There's a lot of words and little to back that up. Don't believe me. You can check it out for yourself. The second is that Cambridge wants honesty and authenticity from an MP. They want someone who's real, who's thinking critically, who understands local dynamics, and again, can take our voices to Ottawa instead of taking talking points made in Ottawa to us. That's not the way the system should work. So my plan here is to lead our fight against the ongoing opioid crisis, to push for affordable housing and pharmacare, and to work for real climate action that makes Cambridge a leader in the green industries of the future, because I think we have that potential, and that's the vision I'm going to push for. So on October 21st, I'm asking you to think critically. Right? The best predictor of the future is the past. So look at people's promises, look at their past actions, and ask whether or not that party has matched up with that, and that person has matched up with that. Don't vote out of fear or habit. Vote out of the future you want to see. And that's why I'm asking you on October 21st to vote for Scott Hamilton. We will not get to new places by following old paths. Thank you.
Thank you, Scott. Brian.
Thank you for being here tonight. I'm encouraged by the fact that there's three parties on this stage who understand the urgency of climate change. Our government has done more for the environment than any federal government in the past. And I simply ask that you take a look at what we've accomplished and our platform. You'll see clearly our aggressive approach to environmental protection that's achievable, realistic, and won't leave hundreds of thousands of Canadians behind. In this riding, this race is going to come down to myself and the Conservative candidate. If you don't want another vote in the House of Commons to go to Andrew Scheer, a plan that the Conservatives can't even bother to show up to defend, then I'm the best candidate for Cambridge to continue to have an MP with a green agenda in Ottawa. I hope you choose to continue with a plan that works, our plan, and we can keep moving forward together. On October 21st or before, please vote for Brian May and the Liberal Party. Thank you.
Thank you, Brian. And to David.
I was grateful for the civility that we had here today, and this is kudos to you as an audience. I appreciate that you were willing to listen to someone who, for many of you, we disagree. But this is what makes Canada great. Currently, there are a few party leaders who have said that they will not allow my leader to speak at different debates. He will be speaking at the national debate, but they didn't support that. That was discouraging for me, that we had federal leaders who spoke openly about wanting to censor another federal leader. But that didn't happen here tonight, and I'm grateful. I hope that you can see that there is reason to be skeptical of the climate alarmism, that we don't come at this as people who are fringe, but we look at the documentation. We started this evening by hearing that climate change is ramping up, but in many cases we continue to see a leveling off or a reversal, but we don't hear about it. It's just not in the papers. I'll give you a few more examples. A decade ago, the scientists promoting global warming saw that sea levels were rising and predicted it would happen faster and more dramatically. They were wrong. Rising sea levels are slowing down. 2 peer-reviewed papers prove that. One in the Journal of Global Planetary Change in 2014 and the other in the Journal of Coastal Engineering in 2013. We've been told that droughts are increasing worldwide. Again, a false claim and a failed prediction. A 2014 paper in the premier science journal, Nature, showed conclusively that the percentage of the globe in drought between 1982 and 2014 was significantly lower. And what about the claim and prediction that hurricanes are getting worse in the U.S.? Again, not true. I've only got 15 seconds, but my list is long of these failed predictions. Ladies and gentlemen, you may disagree with me, but you can't disagree with the facts, and I would encourage you to look into both sides of the story.
Thank you very much, David. As we conclude here this evening, I would just like to echo David's comments on the civility that was in this room tonight. Even when there were a chance for a few of those little boos there at the end in closing remarks, well placed, not out of hand or out of line in my opinion, so thank you for that. To our candidates, I've moderated a number of these things over the years, and never have I worked with a group that stayed on time as well as each of you did. And truly, that is respectful, that is preparation.
It's these guys.
That's all.
They're
Laura,
good.
Laura
They're
and
good.
Omar, thank you. Absolutely. The gentleman in the second row, who I would like to remind you booed me at the beginning of the evening, raised a point of privilege that I would like to take him up on, but I'm going to do it with a little bit of a twist. He asked that we thank each of our candidates at the end of the debate tonight, and I would agree with that. But rather than thank the absent candidate, which was the point of privilege, I will remind you that Conservative candidate Sonny Atwal was invited and declined the invitation to be here tonight. However, in alphabetical order, I would like to thank, on behalf of our audience and the organizers of this 100 Debates on the Environment Forum tonight, Michelle Brenef of the Green Party, Scott Hamilton of the NDP, David Haskell of the People's Party of Canada, and Brian May of the Liberals. Thanks to each of you for this evening.